So, welcome everyone. Welcome to our first event in a new series of open lectures at the EGS. And that first event will be a talk about Aïcha Liviana Messina's book, The Writing of Innocence, Blanchot and the Deconstruction of Christianity. Aïcha, thank you for being there. And thanks to Patrick French for also participating in this discussion today. Also, special thanks to Christopher Fynsk, not only for participating in today's talk, but also for being receptive to this idea of a new format of open lectures at the EGS. Also, I would like to mention that we will do these events in collaboration with the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade. And please check our schedule of open lectures on the EGS website to learn more about the upcoming events. We will have several of them coming in the following period. And these events will also include not only this type of discussions about books, but also our regular evening lectures that will happen during our final session or our last dance in Saspe. Concerning today's event, its format will be the following. We'll first give a word to the author, to Aïcha Liviana Messina, to tell us something about her work. Then Christopher Fynsk will pose his questions and offer his commentary. Patrick French will do the following. Then, if time is available, then I will pose one or two questions. And again, if we have time, then we would also like to hear some questions from the audience. And I would like to tell you that this event will last for approximately 90 minutes. So this will determine if there will be time for the questions from the audience. Aïcha, thank you again for being here with us today. And I would like to give a word to you to tell us something about your book.
Well, thank you very much. It's the second time I'm in this platform, and I'm very honored about it. So thank you, Nemanja, and thanks also to Christopher Fynsk for trusting in my work. It's the first time I'm speaking about the book, and it's also the first time I will hear opinions and reflections about my book. So it's very special for me, and I'm really happy about it, because until now the book was a sort of secret thing I was hiding, and I think I was a bit guilty about it. I don't know why. It might be related to the topic, the writing of innocence, and probably I write on innocence because I feel guilty all the time. But I had to say this. This is the first time this is giving existence to the book, and I have to get out of my cachette. I have to get out of where I'm hiding. This book is the fruit of really many years of work. The topic of innocence has been an obsession for me for like decades. My PhD thesis was titled The Innocent Destiny on Philosophy. I've been constantly asking myself what makes of innocence a philosophical topic and a topic relevant for philosophy. And this book in a way tries to give a philosophical approximation to innocence. It's difficult for me to present this book because it is made of many threads, there are many different topics in the book. On the one hand, it's a book on Blanchot. The subtitle of the book is Blanchot and the Deconstruction of Christianity. One of the objectives of the book is to locate Blanchot thought in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Blanchot thought has been related by many scholars to the Judaic tradition, or at least the relation between Blanchot and Levinas has been very much remarked and developed, and I think it's an important relation, and it's very important. So Blanchot thought is indeed, there is indeed in Blanchot thought an understanding of Judaism, especially in its ethical exigencies, demands, and consequences. The relation between Blanchot and Levinas is particularly interesting to me because it's not only an intellectual relation, it is also a friendship, and a friendship that has entailed a revolution for Blanchot, a revolution in his thought, in his life, in his writing. But this has been already studied. What I wanted to do in the book, or one thing that I wanted to do in the book, is to frame this relation to Judaism in Blanchot's understanding of Christianity. And this, I think, had not been done. So the book doesn't take a position. Is Blanchot closer to Judaism, or is Blanchot closer to Christianity? This would be a way of opposing different tradition, and also this would be a way of limiting Blanchot to one sole way of thinking. What interested me is that I noticed a long time ago, when more than 2 decades ago, that Saint Paul was very important to Blanchot. I noticed that reading Le Pas au-delà, which is translated in English, The Step Not Beyond, where there are pages, remarkable pages, on the notion of grace, and where Blanchot does not repeat Saint Paul's thought. He repeats his understanding of Saint Paul's thought, but in order to deconstruct it and reaffirm it, reinvent it. So in The Step Not Beyond, in Le Pas au-delà, there is a new way of approximating this Christian notion that is grace, and grace is a way of accepting the law. It's a way of either fulfilling the law or going beyond law. So this interested me particularly because this meant that Blanchot was not only close to Judaism, but also to Christianity. And then I tried to go further in this approximation to Christianity, focusing my attention in the way Blanchot reads Hegel, who also has a peculiar understanding of Christianity and Judaism, and more precisely of Judaism through his conception of Christianity. So one thing that I say in the book, or one thread of the book, can be explained in these terms. Blanchot's relation to Judaism, and I don't speak as a specialist, but rather of my own reading of Levinas also. So Blanchot's relation to Judaism and understanding of Judaism has to be framed in his not only understanding of Christianity, but in his way of rewriting, reinventing, or in his way of reinventing Christian notions, which is related to his way of deconstructing them. And here, by deconstructing or by deconstruction of Christianity, what I mean is not a destruction or an overcoming. Here, I'm very close to Derrida and Nancy's explanation of Christianity, namely an interest for relating to the structure, to what makes possible a construction, and a way of locating in this structure, or in what makes possible a construction, a problem, an impossibility. So Blanchot, one of my hypotheses in the book is that Blanchot, there is in Blanchot a gesture of deconstructing Christianity, but this gesture leads him to rewrite some notion, give them, as I say at the end, a second chance, and hence unfold new ethical and political consequences from this rewriting. I hope my English is okay. So the book is divided in 5 chapters: Law, Grace, Innocence, Apocalypse. These are the four first chapters. And then the 5th one is the deconstruction of Christianity in Blanchot and Nancy. I would say that the first 4 chapters coincide to this objective, providing a description of how Blanchot gives this notion a second chance. And here the challenge was important and interesting, because it meant to address some issues like how can Blanchot be both a reader of Levinas and a reader of St. Paul? How can he affirm justice as a way of affirming the outside? And how can he at the same time think grace as what leads us above the law, or to fulfill the law? And so on the other hand, how can Blanchot be rewriting Christian notions and be at the same time such a deep reader of Nietzsche? So the first 4 chapters of the book seek to respond to this challenge. The 5th chapter of the book, which will probably be the one that we will discuss today, is about the dialogue between Blanchot and Nancy on the deconstruction of Christianity. The idea of a deconstruction of Christianity is pretty clear in Nancy's work, because this has been in Nancy a project. It is not so clear in Blanchot's work, but I first try to show that this gesture is at play in Blanchot. But what is at stake in the 5th chapter is also the reading that Nancy does of Blanchot in 2014, which is a very critical reading and, to my mind, an unexpected reading of Blanchot. Nancy in 2014 criticizes Blanchot's politics, Blanchot's political thinking, and one of the critiques he addresses to Blanchot has to do with the recurrence of Christian notions in Blanchot's thinking. So when I first read Nancy's book, I must say that I didn't understand anything of the book. I didn't understand the thesis, and I didn't understand the the critics, and I didn't understand the arguments that were given as a foundation to these critics. So I read the book many times because I thought of my own limitations. If I didn't understand, it's because there was a problem in me. And after reading many times Nancy's book, I understood two things. Nancy's critics addressed to Blanchot have a relevance that goes beyond Blanchot's work. What I thought is that Nancy's critics were not so much addressed to Blanchot than maybe to himself, to Nancy, or to ourselves, readers of Blanchot, Nancy, Bataille, Derrida. So what I thought reading Nancy's book is that Nancy was worried about our political thinkings and about the instruments we had to think politics today. The other thing that I thought the other thing that came to my mind was first a question. Why does Nancy seem to criticize Blanchot for his Christian thought when Nancy himself is so Christian in his way of thinking? No? So there I thought maybe there is something interesting to delve into. There are maybe different ways of deconstructing Christianity, and different way of engaging the ethical and political relevance of this deconstruction. So this is what I analyzed in the last chapter of the book. So the last chapter of the book is meant to make all this reflection on the way Blanchot rewrites Christian topics fruitful in the contemporary reflection of what is left to us to think ethic and politic. So this is one aspect of the book, which is already in itself pretty dense. I'm very thankful to the people who will present the book today and who have read it, because when I had to read the proof, I felt overwhelmed. It was too much. And this is a critic I address to myself. So this is one aspect of the book. The other aspect of the book is that I think this is not only a book on Blanchot, but also a book with Blanchot. I wanted to think with Blanchot the topic of innocence. And this is the main title of the book, The Writing of Innocence. I changed the topic because it didn't really work for its publication. The first proposal I had was The Fall of Innocence. But it's clearer if I say The Writing of Innocence. So it's also a book on innocence. Now, Blanchot doesn't speak very much of innocence. There are here and there some allusions to innocence. For instance, in the book Le Dernier Homme, The Last Man, or in Le Pas au-delà, there are a few fragments that relate to innocence, but you know how it is in Blanchot. You have a very short fragment and you are lost with it. You don't know where it's going with it. So the book the book doesn't reconstruct the notion of innocence in Blanchot. This is not my objective. Rather, I wanted I was certain that Blanchot could provide me the instrument to think the notion of innocence. And this is maybe the most creative, but maybe also the most fragile part of a book. In the very long introduction of a book, which could be another book actually, I claim that innocence is not something that is behind us. Namely, innocence is not what we lose in order to become a subject. I rather claim that innocence is contemporary to what makes us a subject. Innocence is what makes the subject always already problematic. It is what makes us at once a subject, somebody who says I, but also what makes this I problematic. And this is exactly what describes Blanchot. Blanchot does nothing but speak about the defection of a subject, what has been called also the death of a subject. And in the introduction of the book, I say, well, this topic of innocence, thought in these terms, not as what is past, but as what is contemporary to the subject, not as a lack, what we lose, but as an excess, what troubles us, is on the one hand very problematic, because I think we need sometimes to claim our subjectivity and to respond in one's name. But it is also necessary. We need to relate to something we don't know in order to take decisions, in order to think of revolutions. So this is another thread of the book. I start from the idea that innocence is a twofold topic. It is at the same time a promise and a danger. It is difficult to think because we can think it only as the loss of a subject. But then when I understood that we could think of innocence as the loss of a subject, I found that Blanchot would give me very interesting instruments to think this loss, to put it at stake in his writing, and hence to give it a new history. And actually, these two aspects of the book are does have a relation. They are imbricated. These are not two different books. When I speak of the deconstruction of Christianity in Blanchot, I try to show that these notions, law, grace, innocence, apocalypse, have a new chance. They relate us to new challenges. And when I say that innocence is not behind, but contemporary to the birth of a subject, I try to give a structure of this new chance. So, well, I think I spoke enough, and I'm sorry about my English. I usually speak French. Here I speak Spanish, and I haven't spoken English for a long time, so it was not natural to me. I hope you could understand me.
Very much.
Thank you.
You didn't understand anything, that's right?
No. Nemanja, do you want to get us going, or shall I jump in?
Chris, as we agreed, would you like to start with your questions and commentary?
Okay. Aïcha, that was perfectly clear. Thank you. It's and I must say also a great pleasure to listen to your English with those slight touches of French and Spanish. It's wonderful. it's beautiful, very effective. It is as you presented it beautifully, I thought, and it is a book full of really important things, very moving things, very challenging things. When you get into Nancy, for me, very upsetting things. It's it is a very rich undertaking, and you presented it in that way just now, I thought, and so I thought it was a very effective presentation. And I enjoyed it very much, and I thank you for the work. It's obviously how could I say this? This is a work undertaken out of a tremendous impassioned need and a commitment, and one feels that, and that's wonderful. As I was reading it, I had there were two general questions that I brought. Because I've worked on this, and you're very generous on this in a footnote with me. Because I've worked so much on the question of infancy, the question of innocence is one that I feel very sympathetic with and very moved by. And as I was following you on this, and I thought it was very compelling. I kept wondering about a dimension of innocence that I didn't hear you address so much, but I think had to be there, and that was this yes that comes up in Blanchot, which has touches of innocence to it, and you see that already in The Madness of the Day, where you have a no that encapsulates the whole book, or the récit, no more récit, never again. And that's a no, very much like the no of refusal that you address at one point in the book. In fact, I think it's the same thing. But at the same time, there is this yes that is at the heart of the narrative, and this comes back, I think, in many ways. It comes back in later texts. You might say in Blanchot's Nietzschean side. I think it traverses him, and I think it's perhaps even, well, one can find it, I think, even when he starts talking about le neutre, because there is in the exposure to le neutre some sort of spring that occurs, some sort of movement that occurs, and is possibly the ground of an affirmative act, despite the extremity of the situation. And so it's something. There's something in innocence that is also that carries an innocence, or that and I was just wondering about that. But if I go to so I make that as a note. I was thinking and wondering about the yes as I was reading. But as we came into, particularly in the last part on Nancy, a question sort of came into focus for me, and I wanted to ask you to read with us a part of a text from the unavowable community. So let me preface this by saying that I think that you are raising questions, important questions, about the status of politics and the ethico-political in Blanchot, and how his thinking can potentially, even as you put it, present dangers in this respect. But I think you're taking up Nancy's assertion that he sort of fails to think politics in a way that would be adequate to the problems of our time or our socio-political situation. And that brings us to the status of what we understand the political to be. In the early 80s, I had the opportunity to work with Nancy and La Coulabout around the question of what the political is. I'd say both in terms of ontic engagements, but also in terms of, let's just say, an ontological dimension. And so when they created the Centre de Recherche sur l'essence du politique, they used frequently, and this was, La Coulabout was doing this a lot, they used frequently a distinction between le politique and la politique. And it sounds as though at certain points in Nancy that he cannot tolerate, or he cannot quite understand, Blanchot's way of dwelling with what they were thinking together as le politique. And so you see this even in the very first response to Blanchot in the inoperative community, where he says, well, Blanchot fails to think how community relates to, and I can't remember the set of terms, but these are standard political terms, community politics, so forth. And it's kind of shocking because a reader of Blanchot will know that Blanchot could not have used such terms, given his thought, that he was questioning all of this very profoundly. But the question then remains: how do we think about the political in Blanchot? Forgive me, I kind of lost my train there. Or how do we think about what I tend to use a phrase rather than the political or the ethical, the ethico-political. And there's a passage in the La Communauté Inavouable, the unavowable community, where this question comes to the fore very directly. And I think you allude to it, as I remember, reading too quickly, but nevertheless, I think it's worth dwelling over a little bit, and I wonder if you could react to it in relation to your own thinking. And so it's a little bit long. It comes at the beginning of the second part of the unavowable community, and it's when he returns to the May 68, and this is a passage that is, I think, very much consistent with his writings from May 68, but even prior to it. As you know, those of you who have studied Blanchot, you'll know that he reacted exuberantly to the events of 68. For him, this was like, here it is. This is what I've been waiting for. And so you have that in Foucault, tel que je l'imagine, I think it is, and various statements about what it was like to be in the streets. But in this text, in this beginning of the second half, he talks about 68, and then he goes back to the event at the Metro Charonne. And so I'm going to pick it up in the English. It's page 31, and I hope you don't mind. I'm going to read a little bit, but I'm hoping that this will trigger you in some ways, because there are certain aspects of this that are kind of striking in relation to your work. So on page 30, actually, he's talking about the poetic initiative that is 68. Everybody had something to say and at times to write on the walls. What exactly mattered little. Saying it was more important than what was said. And what it is, poetry was an everyday affair. A use of language which manifests a form of freedom. And I would want to emphasize that throughout this period, Blanchot is thinking about freedom. It's a term that is very insistent in his political writings. And so he takes up the way in which there's a kind of carnivalesque quality to the 68 events. And then he continues. I'm on page 31, and he says, he describes this as an innocent presence, This is the situation on the streets. An innocent presence, a common presence, ignoring its limits, political, because of its refusal to exclude anything, and its awareness that it was, as such, the immediate universal, with the impossible as its only challenge, but without determined political wills, and therefore at the mercy of any sudden push by the formed institutions against which it refused to react. It is that absence of reaction, Nietzsche could be said to be its inspiration, which permitted the adverse manifestation to develop and which it would have been easy to prevent or to fight. So he's saying, most immediately here, that we have in this innocent presence a form of political movement that is actually without ressentiment. It's beyond ressentiment. And this is something I've tried to write about. I wrote an essay and presented it in Geneva a few years ago in an awful conference. But anyway, it's something that I've struggled with in Blanchot. I'm trying to understand his notion of a politics beyond ressentiment, which I think is an innocent politics in the way you're saying. But for there to be beyond ressentiment, there has to be this movement that this yes that I'm talking about. So let me continue reading. It gets quite powerful. I'm going a little bit long, but I hope this will be generative. The impossibility of recognizing an enemy, no opposition, of taking into account a particular form of adversity, all that was vivifying while hastening the resolution, though there was nothing to be resolved, given that the event had taken place. The event? Had it taken place? He goes on, that was and still is the ambiguity of presence, understood as instantly realized utopia, and therefore without future, therefore without present, in suspension as if to open time to a beyond of its usual determinations. Presence of the people, recourse to that complacent word was already abusive, or else it had to be understood not as the totality of social forces ready to make particular political decisions, but as the instinctive refusal to accept any power, in its absolute mistrust and identifying with a power to which they would delegate themselves, and therefore in political in their declaration of impotence. Hence the ambiguity of the committees that multiplied, pretending to organize disorganization while respecting the latter, and that were not supposed to distinguish themselves from the anonymous and innumerable crowd from the people spontaneously demonstrating. Thus the actionless action committees, their difficulty of being, the difficulty they had in existing, or that of the circle of friends, and this is again another important word, who disavowed their previous friendship in order to call upon friendship. Camaraderie without preliminaries, vehiculated by the requirement of being there, not as a person or subject, but as the demonstrators of a movement fraternally anonymous and impersonal. So friendship responds to an exigency to be there in this moment. And then he gives us now the example of Sharon, which is quite extraordinary. Presence of the people in their limitless power, which in order not to limit itself, accepts doing nothing. I believe that in the still contemporary period, there has not been a clearer example than the one that affirmed itself with sovereign amplitude when, to walk in procession for the dead of Sharon, an immobile, silent crowd gathered, whose number there was no reason to count because there was nothing to be added, nothing to be subtracted. It was there as a whole, not to be counted, not to be numbered, not even as a closed totality, but as an integrality, intégralité, surpassing any whole, imposing itself calmly beyond itself. A power supreme, because it included, without feeling diminished, its virtual and absolute powerlessness, symbolized accurately by the fact that it was there as an extension of those who could no longer be there. They are there as an extension of those who could no longer be there. The infinite, answering the call of finitude and prolonging it while opposing it. I believe that a form of community happened then, different from the one whose character we had thought to have defined, one of those moments when communism and community meet up and ignore that they have realized themselves by losing themselves immediately. It must not last. It must have no part in any kind of duration. That was understood on that exceptional day. Nobody had to give the order to disband. Dispersal happened out of the same necessity that gathered the innumerable. Separation was instantaneous without any remainder, without any of the nostalgic sequels that alter the true demonstration, by pretending to carry on as combat groups. He goes on, the people are not like that. They are there, then they are no longer there. They ignore the structure that could stabilize them. Presence and absence, if not merged, at least exchange themselves virtually. This is what makes them formidable for the holders of a power that does not acknowledge them, not letting themselves be grasped, being as much the dissolution of the social fact as the stubborn obstinacy to reinvent the latter in a sovereignty the law cannot circumscribe, as it challenges it while maintaining itself as its foundation. Okay, I've gone on very long, but I know your familiarity with Blanchot will help you, re-engage that passage. There are so many topics there that are pertinent to what you write in your analyses. The problem of the presence of innocence being absence, and how does one think about this politically? And then of course the power that he asserts here, and the exigency that he asserts here as a political agency, ethical political agency, but which is immediately without a political translation in determinate terms. So I just wondered how you react to this passage in relation to you're struggling with this question of what politics follows here, or how do we think about this as political or failing to be political in some sense?
Many thanks, Christopher, for your two beautiful questions or your remark, which is really interesting, and for your question with this passage from the La Communauté Inavouable has been has meant a lot for me because it is one of the parts that I most like in La Communauté Inavouable and in general in Blanchot's political thinking. It's nice to come back to my initial love for La Communauté Inavouable, which is one of the first books I read of Blanchot, and I saw all that it was opening in the political domain. No? So about the first point, the fact that in the book, the idea of innocence as affirmation, the Nietzschean yes of Zarathustra, is not very present. This is true. I don't have an explanation. I mean, it just, there were so many things that I tried to gather, so I didn't take this path. When you were speaking, I was thinking on the one hand of Nietzsche, of Zarathustra, of which I do speak in the book.
Yes.
But also of the yes in Levinas, the yes of the other, and also in a text that I like very much in L'Humanisme de l'autre homme. Levinas speaks of, I think, a yes innocent de conjonction ontologique. And I think in Levinas there are not a lot of occurrences of the word innocent, of course, but there are at least two. And I think they are very interesting because they engage a reflection on the subject that cannot withdraw. They engage a reflection on the subject in its very exposure, or in the radicality of his exposure, on his nakedness, to maybe to speak a more concrete, to use a more concrete term. So I think this yes interests me more when it is a yes from which we cannot withdraw, and then is not exempt of violence. No, if we follow Levinas's thinking. Maybe I didn't speak about this clearly affirmation dimension of Blanchot's thinking, which does exist, and especially when he speaks about grace, because it finds grace not as what allows us to depart from death, as is the case in St. Paul, but as what entails a love for death, an affirmation of finitude. And this is wonderful. No? Blanchot rewrites St. Paul, but twisting it completely. It is not a matter of leaving aside finitude and what leads us to the sin, to our sinful condition. It is, on the contrary, an affirmation of finitude in its infinity, that henceforth leads us beyond good and evil, beyond the opposition between a sinful condition and a redeemed condition. So there is this affirmative part in Blanchot's thought, and I could have emphasized it more. But maybe what I think that it's not that something lacks in Blanchot. Of course, nothing lacks, because if something had to be completed in Blanchot, it would not be Blanchot any longer. But what worries me in Blanchot, after 2 decades of reading him, is that it's too evanescent for me. This yes does not inside incise, does not, I don't know how to say it, incise, maybe
cut in or breach, or
sufficiently in the world. It does have it does have an incision, but it withdraws. And this is Blanchot, and I don't think that we should change Blanchot. It's like the relation to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. You cannot change the person, but you can change the relation or yourself. So I have nothing to say to Blanchot, but me as a reader of Blanchot, there is something that is too subtracted, and I need to locate this yes in another place. So in answer to your question, I will say, yeah, there is this yes. I could have emphasized it more, and I think that this reading is doing of St. Paul is really beautiful, and there is a yes for finitude. I don't know if it's finitude or finitude, but I would say that I prefer Levinas's yes in this sense. I prefer the yes that qui dénude, that the yes of the fragility of the eye, of his nakedness. I prefer the yes that cannot subtract. In the sense, I prefer the yes that is also the innocence that is also guilty. And also, but this might be for another conversation on Blanchot, in which we would read the text. Le neutre is, I think it's a very complicated term, because if le neutre is neutre, it can be neither yes nor not. And it's true that there is an affirmation there, but it's an affirmation that cannot be separated from the negation. But I think we have to read Blanchot there, because what is so interesting in Blanchot, it's that it's an experience. It's an experience. It's an experience of the way he's writing interrupts our categories of thinking. And I think this is what makes me so close of Christopher's work, but it's always a close reading of Blanchot and not a way of speaking abstractions on Blanchot.
Thank you.
But on the other side of the question, May 68, Mai 68, and this passage from La Communauté Inavouable. I said in French because inavouable is English. This is really difficult.
Yeah.
Like I have to practice. So I will say many things. This passage has been, like, for me, as I said before, a way of entering into Blanchot, of being enthusiastic about his thinking, about what it opened in the political thinking. And also, I think, in that time when I first read La Communauté Inavouable, Nancy hadn't written any critical book on Blanchot, and I thought it was extremely interesting to discover, or rather to have new elements for thinking politics in a book that was the fruit of a dialogue. I think this is wonderful. What happened in France in these years, and that I think characterizes what we call French thought, is wonderful because it's all the fruit of encounters and exchanging letters or conversations, hence encounters in its true sense. No, something changes for Nancy when he reads Blanchot. Something changes for Blanchot when he reads Nancy. Something radically changes for Blanchot when he meets Levinas. Radically. Something changes, I don't know, for Deleuze when he reads English literature. So French thought is comes from the question of what it means to encounter another writing, another thought. No? So I think this is very interesting also to understand La Communauté Inavouable, the explosion it is when it's published. The other point that I found very important to understand the relevance of La Communauté Inavouable is that it's not only a book on Mai 68, on May 68, it's a book about the condition of possibility of May 68. And what Blanchot says, not necessarily in La Communauté Inavouable, but in his political writings around May 68, is that May 68 exists on the condition that we write. Why does he say that? Because if Mai 68 is an interruption, then we need writing, namely the interruption of a meaning, the interruption of a system, what puts at stake the death of an author, in order for May 68, if you want, to happen. No? So what Blanchot says is that politics and writing are inseparable. And this is extraordinary because he says we are not there to write on events. We are there to be the event. We are not there to write on the revolution. Revolution is our responsibility. It is the demand we have to respond to by writing. So there is no May 68 if the writer is not exposed to the interruption of a meaning. This is very interesting. And when I teach Blanchot, this is what I prefer to teach. I think that in this sense, Blanchot is very close to Hegel. I mean, he's saying exactly the opposite, but both say we are not there to speak about. We are there to be exposed to what we speak about. And because without this exposure, there are no events, there are no revolution, there is nothing that will either take shape or be suspended. So this is what I would, this is where I would focus my attention. Now I think that this is not directly what Nancy criticizes of Blanchot, but I think that this is what is at stake in Nancy's critique of Blanchot. I think that what worries Nancy, but as I said before, as what worries Nancy, not necessarily in Blanchot, but in what became a sort of mauvaise habitude, so bad habit of left thinkers, is to stick to this idea of interruption, is to be too much interrupted. Blanchot affirms the interruption, and this is extremely interesting because of what I've said before, because for Blanchot, the event is inseparable from writing. And again, I would not change anything of Blanchot. But I think that the point is that we cannot make a world if we don't interrupt the interruption, or if we don't come back to the world. We could not make a world if May 68 was really infinite. So what Blanchot says that is very interesting is that the infinite character of a revolution belongs to writing, no? And the word has to go on and still be built. And I think that what we could say is that now our problem, our theoretical problem, and our practical problem is to think our way of coming back to a world that is constantly interrupted by writing. So my response is not to criticize Blanchot, but to say we have to address new problems, and we have to address new problems knowing that the interruption to which writing responds is necessary, is very interesting, is brilliant, but can be dangerous if we become fascinated by it. Yeah, this is what I would respond now. I didn't. There is also a passage of the only time I think that Blanchot speaks of Benjamin is also about the question of innocence. And it is innocence thought as a subtraction, a not being there. I think we have to think innocence in our being there.
Yeah. It's yes. Thank you. A beautiful answer. For me, the experience of reading Blanchot and the way you're describing is that the experience of the interruption drives into the world, so that it's and without the awareness of that interruption, it becomes simply politics. And it seems to me that we must always keep in mind that question of the political, and also what manifests itself in that moment that he describes, and that Sharon, this moment of where the people is in play, as he says. But that's I thought it was a beautiful answer, Aïcha, a beautiful answer. Thank you very much. I was going to add just one tiny thing. And with regard to your presentation of just tiny thing, a little footnote, I'll tell you where I'm working right now. And that is that I think that the encounter with Levinas was extremely important for Blanchot, obviously tremendously important. But I think also the encounter with Antelme was very important. And the reason I say that is that when you read Mascolo, on his on the community that formed around Anthem, which Blanchot came to join. He describes what he calls a Judaisation. They became Jewish. And I have a strong suspicion that Blanchot's becoming Jewish has a lot to do with his entry into that collective, into that community, actually. And that's an interesting sort of, how can I say, lived experience of post-war Europe that helps define what being Jewish might have meant for Blanchot, beyond the extraordinary statements he makes about being Jewish, which are philosophical statements. But there's also there's a lived dimension to this that I think is fascinating. And so my question has always been, why didn't Blanchot convert? Mascolo basically says we converted. But Blanchot didn't convert, and I've always been interested in that because everything was there in a certain sense. And anyway, that was just for a future discussion between us, Anthem and Blanchot and so forth. I should leave the screen now to Patrick and Nemanja. Forgive me if I took too long. I'm having fun and not giving enough attention to time. So thank you so much, Aïcha. That was really nice.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So over to me. Just on last point, that Blanchot's entry into that community is also, or part of that community is also Marguerite Duras.
Yes.
I think it's not the next section, but the section after. Blanchot is writing in La Communauté Inavouable. So that's just another footnote to a footnote. But yes, thank you. And thank you to Chris and Nemanja for giving me the opportunity to engage with Aïcha's wonderful book, which I found absolutely riveting and compelling, and really interesting that you said earlier that you wanted to use Blanchot as an instrument to engage with the question of innocence. I suppose for me, Blanchot isn't someone who I usually look for instruments to do something with, but you met that challenge wonderfully, I think. So perhaps I'll start just by saying a bit about my positioning myself, as it were, in relation to what you're writing about. I suppose in a very banal sense, personally, I also feel kind of perpetually guilty and innocent at the same time, and kind of teasing apart those two affects is difficult. But in terms of my work, I'm a literary scholar. I work on French literature, and I've written 2 books on Bataille. One which was a reading of Histoire de l'œil, contextualizing kind of close reading of Histoire de l'œil. But the second one which was called After Bataille, Sacrifice, Exposure, Community, tried to think the thematics of sacrifice in Bataille, and as the title suggests, trace its legacy, as it were, or the limits of this thinking of sacrifice in Bataille through Blanchot's engagement with Bataille, and then Nancy's engagement with Bataille, and Blanchot's engagement with Nancy and with Duras. So that's I kind of approach Blanchot through Bataille, really. I have also written separately about Blanchot's friendship, in italics, with Bataille, but again, from a slightly, I wouldn't say critical, but from I'll just use that word for the shorthand, critical perspective, which tries to think how might one define friendship from the other side, as it were, not through Blanchot, but through, outside Blanchot's matrix of what friendship means. And also about the dialogue or non-dialogue between Blanchot and Bataille around Louis-René Desforêts and his book Le Bavard. So I suppose quite a literary approach to Blanchot, and also approaching Blanchot through the perspective of Bataille, with whom, I think his engagement with Bataille was also to some extent transformative, but also probably more transformative for Bataille than it was for Blanchot, perhaps. But that's also another topic of another conversation. But yes, I found that your book compelling. I think I really admired the way that you stuck really tenaciously, and I use that in a good sense, to the logic of Blanchot's, sorry, Freudian slip, to the logic of Blanchot's thought, the way that the negative isn't used up in Hegelian sublation, but there's a kind of unemployable negativity, to use Bataille's phrase. I was also interested in your final chapter because I found myself, so I published my book After Bataille that I mentioned in 2007, so quite a long time before Nancy's The Disavowed Community. And then I kind of moved on to other things, Proust mostly, and kind of lost touch with that. So I, in fact, wasn't so aware until recently when I reread the footnote in Chris's Last Steps and Nancy's book, and also Leslie Hill's book about this kind of differend, if that's what it is, between Nancy and Blanchot. I found myself rereading myself and thinking that my account, you know, I read myself saying, for example, that that Blanchot read in Bataille or wrote in the unavowed community of a moment of dispossession and abandonment which exceeds relation between individuals, exceeds perhaps the limits of what goes under the name love, and communicates with an archaic, secret mode of experience which precedes any memory. So I found myself kind of agreeing a bit with Nancy's critique of Blanchot as this, you know, this archaic, you know, and you know, there's a lot to say and more to say about that, and to problematize that insight. But so that was another kind of thing that I got out of your book, the close attention to that dialogue, which is also a kind of dialogue of many different voices. But I suppose I thought it might be useful to ask questions rather than go on about my thoughts, although the questions are guided by my thoughts, obviously. And I suppose in light of what I said earlier about approaching Blanchot through Bataille, and myself as someone who thinks about literature, I suppose one thing I had in mind was, I think the end of Bataille's introduction to his book, Literature and Evil, where he writes something like, I won't be able to remember it exactly, but literature is not innocent and it ought to confess itself guilty. But then he goes on to say that it belongs to, or it pertains to, what he calls a hypermorality. So literature is not innocent. And yet literature has quite a large place in your book and in Blanchot's thinking about innocence as you articulate it. And in your thinking about innocence, and you various literary figures punctuate the book. I think Dostoevsky's Prince Mishkin right at the beginning, Kafka kind of obviously, but Billy Budd, Meursault, that was really interesting. And sometimes they seem to point to a kind of idiocy. You talk about this notion of idiocy, which is not ignorance, but pertains to innocence. So I suppose I had questions, both, you know, one more general question about the place of literature in your writing, in the writing of Innocence, which I suppose is also a wider question about the place of literature for Blanchot, which is also an impossibly general question. But also how you position innocence in relation to idiocy. So perhaps I have other questions, but I'll start off with that one and see how we get on. But yeah, literature, the place of literature and the relation of idiocy to innocence.
Well, thanks a lot for all you said about the place that Blanchot has in your own interest in literature, and also thanks a lot for your two questions, because I had written something initially in order to present the book, and when I decided it was too complicated and I didn't read it, but it was exactly on what you say about the role of literature in this thinking of innocence. I think that what Blanchot does with his reflection on literature is what makes of Blanchot a very important philosopher that is, in my opinion, not less important than Hegel. Blanchot, at the beginning, writes what seems to be critical essays on literature, on the books that are being published, or on books that belongs to the history of literature. It seems to do nothing more, but it's allowed to be a critic. One has to acknowledge this fact. But it seems to be nothing more than writing about literature. But each time he writes about literature, he's writing about philosophy, and he's deconstructing philosophical terms in order to push them further. So this is very interesting, because he appears to be a literary critic, but in reality, he's disposing the elements for, I think, what is a very important philosophy. What I say in the book, the book starts with this question of innocence, and in a moment I say, well, how do we think innocence? No, if innocence means, if innocence means the ignorance of good and evil, if innocence has to do with the impossibility of being a subject, how do we think innocence? In the moment in which we think it, we lose it. So it appears to be an unthinkable topic. Now, if innocence is not something that belongs to the past, but if it's concomitant, contemporary to the birth of a subject, in the sense that in the moment in which the subject is constituted, he's exposed to its very impossibility, this is Blanchot, then maybe to think innocence is to relate to this impossibility of a subject. And this is exactly what Blanchot does with a question of writing. To write for Blanchot is to be exposed to what threatens the subject, to what makes it impossible. And this is exactly what Blanchot thinks that is at the heart of literature. So it's not that in Blanchot literature is innocent. No, innocent is not a question of ontology. There is no being innocent. There is rather a being exposed by innocence. No? So Blanchot doesn't say that literature is innocent, but that literature consists in the exposure of his exposure that innocence is. And this is very interesting, because it's not only that Blanchot thinks that literature is the point of view of innocence, he also thinks that literature does what the Hegel system cannot do, namely to reflect on the negative that constitute knowledge. In Hegel, all positivity is constituted by negativity, but what we cannot do in ultimate term is to reflect the negative that constitutes the positive. What literature does is precisely expose us to this negative. So literature has a crucial philosophical relevance. It exposes the transcendental that philosophy cannot reflect on, which means that literature does not only expose us to the exposure of innocence, but that innocence exposes philosophy to its transcendental dimension. So philosophy has a brilliant, so innocence has, if my reasoning is makes sense, if all this makes sense, innocence has the highest philosophical task. But this is possible only because literature, this is possible only because of a relation between literature and philosophy. Philosophy could not do it by itself. It needs an instance where the death of a subject is exposed.
Yes, sorry, that's really interesting. And I think one of the things that interests me, if literature has this task to kind of expose philosophy to its other, for want of as a shorthand, often, and this is the reason why I pointed to these different literary characters that punctuate your book, that these seem to be embodied in a protagonist in some way, Meursault, Billy Budd, and so on. And I wondered if, so you spoke about literature reflecting on innocence or reflecting on the negativity, the unemployable negativity, but I'm interested in the way in which innocence ends up being embodied in a character of Meursault or Mishkin, and that's why I asked the question about idiocy or the idiot. Is the innocent character always in some sense an idiot or someone who is kind of outside, yes, or some marginal relation to the social order?
Yes. Well, again, thank you very much for this question, because all my interest for Innocence started on the first hand. It started with the experience of disease and somebody departing from the world. There I felt that we were exposed to what Blanchot calls the innocence of dying. In contemporary to this moment, I was thinking of Prince Mishkin. I had read The Idiot a long time ago, but I had seen Kurosawa's movie on The Idiot. And these actors are, the actor is so innocent, no? And the landscapes, white of snow, and I remember perfectly this moment in which his idiocy was transforming everything, the characters, their values about good and evil, their power, their way of being mean and selfish, and our own ways of seeing. So I thought the idiot, in reality, I mean, in reality, the others are stupid, and the idiot, what is the one who makes possible what Nietzsche would call a transformation of a point of view, no? And then I read again the Idiot from Dostoevsky, and I realized that the idiot at the beginning of the book is graced. He's about to be condemned to death, and is graced. So he has something very. He goes through something that Blanchot knows very well, is to be at the point of being executed, and be alive, no? But the idiot is also idiot because in him life and death converge. So is graced. In Saint Paul, to be graced means to be redeemed from death, from what makes us sinful. But I think that in Dostoevsky, here, innocence is not to be redeemed from death. It's rather to be in this point in which life and death meet, and to see the world from this encounter between life and death. So this is why at the beginning of the book, I say other innocence is something that belongs to a mythical past, paradise. It's the quality of a pure heart, and we have nothing to say about it. Either innocence is this idiocy, is this way that in which life and death meet, and this is what happens when you are going through a disease, for instance. And it is not something, it is not a lack, it is an excess. It is what exceeds the subjects, but that entails a whole transformation of values, of the way of knowing, of perception. And again, and I think that it is not merely random that literature is so fascinated by these idiot characters, Dostoevsky, Melville, but Victor Hugo, Camus. I don't know, maybe this is all what literature is about, without literature being innocent, of course, otherwise it would be boring. Because also what I say in the book is that innocence is dangerous, no? And innocent characters also commit crimes. So it is not without blood.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I could have lots of other questions but around I know Nietzsche, Deleuze, innocence. But I think Nemanja, I think maybe I'll pause there or stop there for questions, other questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
So we're close to the time limit, so I'll try to be as succinct, as precise in my questions as possible. I have two, and my first one is somewhat related to a question that Professor French posed, and it is about the relationship between myth and literature. Because in your book, you say that Nancy's conception of myth changes at some point, because it was very important. Distinction between myth and literature was very important for him in inoperative community, also in Nazi myth. But then you explain how after inoperative community, this conception of myth changes. So my question here is actually twofold. What happens with literature in this new conception of myth that is begins to develop in Nancy's work? And second one is, how will you describe Blanchot's understanding of myth? Because myth shows up at crucial moments in Blanchot's work, but when it shows up, it's never a simple recourse to myth. It is always a myth that is tweaked in a way. So for example, the nature of Orpheus' song, Narcissus that falls in love, not with himself, but with himself as other, and so on. So this is the first question that is twofold from my side.
Yeah, thanks, Nemanja. This is the most difficult question, actually. When I read the first time Nancy's book, I really didn't understand why he was claiming that Blanchot's uses of literary figures was amounting to create new myths. No, I don't know if he says this as bad as I'm saying it, but this is what I vaguely reconstruct. I mean, he was associating Blanchot's uses of a literary figure in La Communauté Inavouable with myth. So Madame Edwarda, well, I don't know, the characters of Marguerite Duras, La Maladie et la Mort. And I couldn't understand because let's say, Nancy's deconstruction of the myth in, amongst other books, Le Mythe Nazi, is not in contradiction with Blanchot's idea of literature, for instance. And moreover, I think that Nancy would have never said what he said without Blanchot. And without Blanchot's reflection on literatures. So I really couldn't understand it. Then after speaking with other people who agreed with Nancy, but maybe without thinking too much about the book, because they had never read Blanchot also, I understood what they understood by myth, which is something that is imposed acritically. So as if Madame Eduarda became a sort of new myth. No, I don't know if this makes sense, but then it means that it is not so much what Blanchot says about literature and myth that matters for Nancy, but how Blanchot in this book puts at stake characters that belong to literature. But I said this is a very difficult question because this is not something that I worked enough, the question of myth. But I shared completely your perplexity when I read Nancy's book. Now, something that I think that something that is a problem for Nancy, and this is questionable. All that Nancy says is questionable. What Nancy says about Blanchot is that in Blanchot's critique of authoritarianism, there is an authoritarian gesture. What Nancy says, maybe taking many steps away from Blanchot and reading Blanchot from very far, Nancy says, in ultimate instance, there is something authoritarian in this voice of the absence. And maybe this is where Nancy locates the mythical aspect of his literary figures. Their meaning becomes at some point authoritarian. This is an attempt to explain Nancy. This is not my point of view. I'm not clear enough about this. But I remember in the book, I also speak about Nancy's text, which in fact was pronounced a few days after Blanchot's death, where he speaks of the myth as the opening of the mouth, and not as instituting narration. But I cannot do much with it right now.
I understand, because it was, you helped me, Hamid. This is something that is puzzling for me as well. And for my other question, it is something that I wanted to ask you about your interpretation in the book. In the book, it is about, you have a big section about the impossibility of knowledge in your book. And you associate this non-knowledge with désoeuvrement. And this non-knowledge is, in your description, something that prevents knowledge from coinciding with itself. it is a failure of knowledge. And then you connect this with your topic of innocence, that is innocence conceived as the impossibility of knowledge. And when I read this, it struck me because it reminded me of a sentence that is repeated several times in Le Pao de la. It reminded me because I have problems. I translated Le Pao de la into Serbian, and I had problems to translate this sentence because we do not have the tense that is appropriate for this sentence. So I had to invent stuff. The sentence shows up as, I don't know, but I have the feeling that I am going to have known. And then 2 times it shows up in even a little bit different form. It shows up as, I do not know, but I know that I am going to have known. So, and then he has 2, I believe, fragments where he actually interprets this, having known, as not a false appearance, not a mockery, not an ignorance, but a redoubled knowledge. He emphasizes this. So my question, this is, do we go in this direction as non-knowledge that prevents knowledge from coinciding with itself? Or can we go into direction of eternal return, where this is a kind of knowledge, a revelation of eternal return that is actually a revelation, knowledge that entails forgetting in itself?
What is the last one you said?
So connection with eternal return and a kind of knowledge that entails forgetting.
Okay. Let me write it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is really a great question. And this is very important for the relation between innocence and philosophy. This recurrences in Le Pao de la of je ne sais pas, il n'y a pas de jeu pour ne pas savoir, je ne sais pas, mais je sais que je vais avoir su, je ne sais pas, nous savons. This was the topic of my PhD thesis on the innocent destiny of philosophy, and there Blanchot reads Plato and Hegel. It's a very interesting way of relating to the history of philosophy and to the dialectical philosophers. Because he's thinking of I only know I don't know of Plato. He's thinking of the fact that in order to know I have to die in the Phaedo and in the Apology of Socrates, and he's thinking of the role of a negative in Hegel. And what the question that you are addressing, I think, is exactly what is at stake in these pages and in the peculiarity of their writing. Is death what makes possible knowledge? This would be Plato and Hegel for different reasons. Is death what escapes knowledge and what makes knowledge always incomplete? Or is death what entails knowledge revolution and knowledge exposure to an ignorance that makes it possible? And I think this is the third path that Blanchot is taking. He's trying to expose knowledge to an ignorance that makes it possible, in order to relate us to ignorance as what I said before, the ultimate task of philosophy. And in this sense, you are right. Blanchot does not give up the task of knowing. For instance, in the writing of the disaster, he speaks of un savoir sans vérité, a knowledge without truth. In La part du feu, he says, he speaks of l'ignorance d'un savoir hagard, the ignorance of I don't know how to say hagard in English, but it's even always ends up putting together ignorance and knowledge in such a way that ignorance is not a lack of knowledge, but let's say the ultimate dialectical task that exposes knowledge to is a condition of possibility, but that is not in the hand of knowledge, or that is not in the hand of a philosopher. This is why he says un savoir sans vérité. This is very interesting. I cannot completely clearly respond this answer, but I think it's definitely very important to understand the place that Blanchot has in the history of philosophy, which I think is not minor. I mean, if it was for me, Blanchot would be in the libraries in philosophy or in both, you know. But it cannot be only in one place.
Thank you, Aïcha. Maybe is there something that professors Fynsk and French would like to add?
Nemanja, no, this has been wonderfully rich. I don't need to come back more. I just want to thank Aïcha. Did we want to see? I know that there's a time issue. We said we would be finishing at 1:30. It's getting on. Do we want to see if there are a couple questions in the audience, or